Hello, it's Kim Knight here from the Art of Health and Science of Wellbeing. And our topic today on the What Creates Illness series is stress. And this is one of my favourite topics. Not that I like being stressed, but it's one of my favourite topics to speak about and to help people understand and make changes. So the whole point of this video series is to understand all the different aspects that go towards creating illness. And stress is one of the major factors that we're going to have to look at. According to Harvard University, at least 80% of illness can be attributed to stress. So it does play a major role. So if we're going to understand stress and how it contributes to illness, we're going to have to ask ourselves, well, what actually is stress? And a lot of the time people may find themselves saying things like, my job is stressful, or you're stressful, and continuously putting it outside themselves. And whilst it may be true that things outside ourselves do trigger the stress response, all stress is actually an internal experience. No matter where the trigger comes from, the experience happens inside of us. Now, we have a part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, and it has two parts which work as a team. And one part is the sympathetic nervous system response, and one part is the parasympathetic nervous system response. And the way I like to remember things is that S stands for stress, SNS is more to do with the stress response. And I just remember that because they both begin with S. So they are both needed, both these sides of the autonomic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system response is more to do with what goes on in our body when we're relaxed. And the sympathetic nervous system response is more to do with what goes on in our body when we feel under threat. And it may be a real threat to our life, or it may be a perceived threat. But the interesting thing is, as far as the body is concerned, because its number one job, if you like, is to make sure that we stay alive, and we tend to forget that in our busy lives, but our body is continuously making sure that we stay alive, then whether it's a perceived threat or a real threat, the body will respond in the same way. Because it has to make sure that it's looking after us. And so what we could say is that the sympathetic nervous system response is like a SOS response. And it's a very valid part of what goes on in the body. But in order to understand what effect this has on the creation of illness, we need to look at, well, what happens when our body is functioning in the parasympathetic nervous system response, and what is going on when our body is functioning in the sympathetic nervous system response. And to put it very briefly, for example, if you felt you were under threat, say you were in a house and all of a sudden you noticed that it was on fire and you had to get out very, very quickly, then automatically, without you having to think about it, your body would switch into the SNS response in order for it to be able to function to get out of the house. And in order for that to happen, it's going to have to change what's going on inside the body at a system level. So for example, we might need to breathe differently. We will need blood sent to our limbs so that we can run. We may need to see more acutely. And we don't need to digest, so it switches the digestive system off. So when our body goes into the SNS response, the systems inside the body function differently, and that happens immediately. And so we have several different systems in our body. Have the cardiovascular system, endocrine system, nervous system, musculoskeletal system, reproductive system, digestive system. And all these systems go into a different mode when we are either under a real threat or a perceived threat in order to deal with that emergency situation. And that is a good thing, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to deal with the situation. We wouldn't be able to deal with the emergency. But that emergency situation is only meant to be temporary. And then we're meant to go back mainly into the parasympathetic nervous system response, where we're more relaxed. And interestingly enough, this is the response that our body needs to be in if it needs to switch on the self-healing mechanisms inside of us. So you can start to see why it's important for healing to not be stuck in the stress response. Now let's look at some of the things that trigger the stress response. As I said at the beginning, we tend to say things like, well, my job is stressful, or that person is stressful, or my life is stressful, or whatever. And that may well be, but actually those external factors are triggering this stress response inside the body so that all the different systems work differently. And what I should add there is that it's okay, the body is designed to have those systems switched on occasionally, temporarily, for short periods of time. But it is not designed to operate long term under stress. That's like driving your car up the motorway or the freeway in second gear at 200 miles an hour continuously. It's just too much for the body, and it can't sustain it long term. Although it will sustain it for quite a while, because our bodies are incredibly resilient and they put up with a lot from us for a long time. But at some point the body has to say, that's it, I cannot tolerate this level of stress anymore, and I'm going to start sending some symptoms and sending you some feedback. So let's look at some of these stress triggers. And the way I like to divide it up is that they're either external or they're internal. So we have external triggers, such as our social environment, people, work, anything outside of us we could consider external. And when something happens in our environment, that may or may not trigger the stress response internally. And then we have internal triggers. And these divide mainly into two parts. So one will be our thoughts, and our beliefs are attached to our thoughts, or our thoughts are attached to our beliefs. So thinking certain thoughts can actually turn on the stress response. And remember, the body doesn't differentiate between a real emergency or a perceived emergency. It still responds. And the other side of internal stress response is things like our behaviours and our habits. So these are internally driven behaviours and habits, but they're external habits. So for example, if somebody is back-to-backing their appointments, that will create stress in the body because the body doesn't think it has enough time. And interestingly enough, it's a bit of a vicious circle, because when we're stuck in the stress response, one of the key things that is a symptom, if you like, of being in the stress response is that we always feel like we don't have enough time. And when we're truly in the parasympathetic nervous response, we will feel that there is all the time in the world. And there actually won't be any difference to what is going on in the outside, but the difference will be what's going on the inside. And if we're stuck in the stress response, we will feel like there is no time. And this makes total sense, because if we have to get out of a burning building, we have to do that now. There is no time to get out, we have to get out now. And so that's like a side effect, if you like, of being in the stress response, is feeling like there's no time. So if you're continually running around in your life feeling like you have no time, then you may well be in the stress response. It's a good sign to notice and to look for. So we have external triggers which trigger this stress response, and we have our own internal stuff which triggers the stress response. Either our thoughts, what we're thinking, which will trigger emotions as well, and our behaviours, our patterns. So all these things contribute to turning on the stress response. And really what is going on simultaneously is that there's a fear response going on. There's some fear. Now, in the case of a burning house, then that will be a real physical fear. We're afraid for our life. But a lot of the time what is going on is more of an emotional fear, but we don't really realize it. And there are certain fears that are very common for all human beings emotionally. For example, the fear of losing someone or something, the fear of rejection, of being rejected, the fear of feeling our feelings, and the fear of feeling vulnerable. So these are very common fears, and they will also contribute to this stress response going on. And the main problem with stress is that our body cannot heal when it's in the stress response. And this is why it's so important that when we have an illness, and especially a chronic illness, we need to identify what is creating stress in our life, whether it's something external or internal, and then we need to do something about that. We actually have to take some action to reduce the stress. And there are many different ways of doing that. But here's an exercise to take away, is go away and write what I call your stress list. Write down all the things externally and internally that trigger that stress response inside your body. And so one of the keys to changing stress is to become very, very aware of when that stress response gets switched on. And I've been working very diligently since 2006 on this topic, because one day I just woke up and this light bulb went on inside me, and I thought, oh my God, I'm really stressed. And this was actually after I'd recovered myself from chronic fatigue, and because the symptoms had reduced, I suddenly became aware of the level of stress that was going on underneath my symptoms. And I made it a commitment to really identify and reduce stress, which I've done, and my life is very, very different, and I'm very, very different. So I do highly recommend that if you are experiencing physical symptoms or even more mind symptoms like depression or anxiety, then go away and start to identify what are the stressors in your life and start doing something about them. And it will make a huge difference. So thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe if you want updates on this e-series, and also leave some comments. And I look forward to talking again soon.